Hi, welcome back to Greystone Demonstration Garden. I'm Master Gardener George Pesson. Today's episode is compost and worm compost. Composting is the decomposition of organic matter into a humus-like substance. Humus is the end product of compost. So first off, when you have a typical compost pile, the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to be attacked by bacteria. Bacteria are living microbes. Also protozoans and fungi. As the bacteria consumes the organic matter, specifically the carbon and the nitrogen, their bodies heat up to a temperature that could reach up to 140 degrees. And as they give off this heat, they are also helping to kill off pathogens and weed seeds. So once they consume most of the carbon, then the temperature will drop a little bit, and then a lot of insects like centipedes and earthworms and grubs, etc., will be attracted to that compost pile and will also help to break down that organic matter. Okay, so the methods that we use to accelerate this process include the following. First is, now that you know that bacteria and other living things are involved, air and water is necessary. So for water purposes, we need to keep our compost pile moist. Not wet, but moist like a wrung out sponge. And that means watering our pile once or twice a week just to keep it moist. Also, good airflow is important because these materials need oxygen as well as water. By turning our compost pile, we want to bring the outside portions to the inside and the inside portions to the outside, as well as create good airflow throughout the entire pile. Okay, carbon and nitrogen are our basic ingredients when we feed our compost pile. Carbon is going to be our browns, which is going to be our dried leaves and stems and wood chips and newspaper. And our greens are going to be our nitrogen-rich and usually moist substances that include our kitchen scraps and banana peels and all of our green waste in our garden like leaves and stems. Okay, so what we want to do with our carbon-nitrogen ratio is give them a 50-50 ratio. 50% carbon, 50% nitrogen, 50% green, 50% brown. And that's the best way for our compost pile to be able to break down this material. If we add too much browns, the compost pile won't heat up to the necessary temperature that it needs. And if we add too much green, the problem is that the compost pile can become anaerobic, which means decomposition without oxygen, and then it becomes stinky, and we definitely don't want that. Next environmental factor, and this one kind of makes sense, is the size of the pieces that you put into the pile. Obviously, the smaller the pieces, the quicker it's going to take for the decomposition. So you should cut up your pieces before you put it into your compost pile. So usually after about 3 months, we will have enough material that we can then use in our garden. And at this point, what we want to do is we want to screen the compost with a screener that will take out the big pieces and leave just the little pieces that we can then use in our garden. And then the uses for our compost are either going to be A, to amend our beds at the beginning of the season, or B, to use as a fertilizer throughout the season, or another use is as a mulch. We talked about that last week. And then also as compost tea. If you mix the compost with water and then add an aerator to it. This is something that you would see in a fish tank, and the aerator makes the bacteria, the good bacteria, blossom and bloom, and then that provides a lot of good nutrients for your soil. Next, we're going to talk about worm bins and worm composting. Worm composting is the breakdown of organic matter by worms, and we call the end product worm castings. Once a worm digests the organic matter, it then becomes worm castings. The kind of worms that we use are called red wigglers. It's a particular kind of worm that is best used for a worm bin because they're confined. Earthworms, the kind we see in our garden from underground, they don't like to be confined. It gets a little warm and they would probably not do well. But red wigglers do very well in a confined space like that, so we use those in our worm bin. The type of food that we feed our worms is just greens, organic greens. We don't use citrus. We don't use a lot of garlic or onions because that could smell, but all of our kitchen scrap like banana peels, lettuce peels, cucumber peels, melon peels, things like that. And again, chop it up into small pieces because these worms have tiny, tiny little mouths. And also, adding eggshells every once in a while is great for their digestion. It kind of goes through them and cleans them out. So I would also add that to our worm bin. One of the great benefits about worm composting over regular composting is that it's a lot quicker. It can usually take weeks as opposed to months for regular composting. So I would encourage you to use worm composting, or if you have the room, use both. And one of the great things about using composting and worm composting is the sustainability cycle, whereby you are getting fed by the plants in your garden, and then you are using that waste to create compost to nurture them so they in turn can nurture you. And then this cycle just keeps going and going, and that's a beautiful thing. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.